Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Recruiter of Oz. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk about some cool things related to candidate screening. I got ultimate marketing guru Scott Smith here.
Oh, you're too kind. But did you say cool things with candidate screening? I mean, does the candidate have any power over that, first of all, or is that cool? So you guys are sitting behind the scenes kind of giggling?
Well, yes and no.
Oh, go ahead.
Basically, because there are candidates. So there are those candidates who will apply to 20 different jobs in a company. We see those candidates and we're like, yawn and like, why are you making our lives so difficult? Also, my friend Amy, my friend Amy would also comment on this, but there is no like automated bot that filters out your application. Like there are people looking at all these applications, so
Seriously.
It's not like, yeah. And so when you apply to like all of these roles that you're clearly not a fit for, all it does is just make our lives just miserable. So
Interesting.
So companies have like resume screeners, and there's debates as to like how good those are. I think it's varies from case to case, but they look at those profiles, like the recruiter or the resume screener in the ATS system. They are tagged, hey, you got 20 new ones to look at, you better look at them. And depending on the company, not looking at those resumes can factor against your metrics or your performance as a recruiter. So it behooves you to get to all of those. Now, that doesn't mean they're all right. Again, people apply to whatever job just because they're trying to get into a company.
Right.
Which goes back to my thing is, if you're really not qualified for the job, like, don't apply, because you're not going to get it.
Which is kind of funny, because you notice a lot of the job postings happening now, even if you're not sure if you qualify for the role, apply anyway. So which is it, Mark, here? Because that's two messages.
So it depends. So in other words, I'm not going to apply for a I'm not going to apply for a communications role.
Okay.
Because I've never really done it in any of my jobs, right?
Other than, being a recruiter and a sourcer and having to communicate.
But still, even then, there are plenty of other people who do the job, who like have a degree in like marketing, or they have the PR experience, or just they have something, communications degree. Right. They have the qualifications to do it. Whereas me, I'm just like a guy who talks. So sure. I'm not going to do that. And so it's the same thing. Like if a candidate comes in and they apply for like an engineering program manager and a Python software engineer and a QA engineer, like it's like, okay, well, what are you really doing? Like, are you just trying to anything just to get into the company? Which that could be the case. But when candidates do that, they just make everyone else's lives miserable and a lot more difficult. Yeah.
But do those candidates use the same, and this is kind of getting off track, but do they use the same application for all of the different roles, or do they tailor them at least?
Some of them will use the same resume and they just kind of just blast it to each one, and you're like, why? And I get it. Some people, they've done multiple things in their jobs so that they could look like they could apply for multiple roles like that, but some of those roles are just so different from each other, like you just can't can't do it. Now, if you do think that you genuinely are a fit for multiple roles at a company, it's probably a good idea to have like kind of like a couple different versions of your resume or your CV,
right, which is what I do.
Which is, so what do you do for that? Like, how do you have, what are your versions that you have, and how do you do it?
In a perfect world, I would be just doing analyst relations, or maybe even PR. But my whole career, spanning 25 years or so, has really encompassed three major disciplines, and that's public relations, that's analyst relations, and it's communications in general. So the way I've kind of segmented out my experience is really doing these in blocks. So PR was the first 15 years. I went into analyst relations the past 7. Communications has kind of been that red thread through both of them, but it's a lot more difficult, I've found, to sell myself into a communications role with a very analyst relations heavy resume. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at each bits of those experiences. I'm pulling out the specific pieces, say communications or public relations or writing or whatever it is that are going to be really going to be aligned with the ask that the recruiter is making for the given role. And I'm tailoring that resume to each one of those. I mean, it may be a little bit interesting when you start getting into the same company. I generally try not to apply to multiple positions within one
Right.
company, but I have done it. It creates the need for more finesse in how you present yourself, and you really need to show that without lying about it, that you have that broad experience. So that's kind
Right.
of my approach.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that's the way you should do it. I mean, you should have like a couple different versions of your resume. I mean, I don't think you need, I mean, more than two. I mean, maybe max three if you're like that good at
Oh,
like
I've got three. I'm kind of a big deal, man. Yeah. Just kidding. Just kidding. Oh, though, for those of you listening, I am kind of a big deal, but just let you know. But
um
sorry, go ahead, Mark.
oh no, I was gonna say, so I mean, I think that's like one way to kind of like set yourself up in terms of, improving your chances, which I think
Right.
we're gonna talk about that in like a different podcast as well. But that kind of goes with like making sure your background and resume tell the right story. But I think
Agree.
once you actually do that and once you apply,
Hmm.
um, you get the first callback from the recruiter, right? And
You
so what
sure
they do,
hope so, at least. Yes.
yeah. So as long as you don't get the automated email. Now, by the way, just because you get an automated email from the company doesn't mean it nobody looked at your profile. Like somebody looked at
Okay.
your profile, but
Right.
they're just sending an automated email because it's easier to send an automated email.
So before we get into the meat of this call, I have another question as that candidate who's been in a job hunt for a few months now. When it's obvious to people who recommend you or yourself or LinkedIn, I know LinkedIn algorithms are a little bit wonky, but when you're on premium, for those of you who don't know, LinkedIn will say, well, so based on the applicants that have submitted their resumes for this position, you are ranking among the top 25% or the top 10%.
Uh,
Mark, what does that really mean?
that I mean, that just means that doesn't mean anything.
Okay.
I mean, that's just LinkedIn looking at your profile, looking at the words on your profile, and then looking at the words on the job description and saying like, "Hey, you guys matched this much of this much
Woohoo.
percent," right? But that doesn't mean anything. There's no like context behind it, right?
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing behind it. So it's like if that's all they're doing to say that you're good for a job, well then I mean, then you could just copy the job description and just paste it into your LinkedIn
Exactly.
profile. So that's not, luckily, that's not who makes the hiring decisions. That's just
Right.
LinkedIn saying like, hey, it looks like you're a fit for this job. I mean, but
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I would not bet my life on that algorithm.
Okay. But then, so the other part of my question, when you receive a referral from someone who you've worked with, who understands the company that you're with, but you get that referral and then all of a sudden 3 days later we've decided not to move forward with your candidacy, and
Yes,
let's make the operational assumption that that candidate is qualified to do that job at that company. Okay, so they
yes.
have the amount of experience they need, they've run teams, they've done whatever, to meet the prerequisites for that job. What happens there?
Yeah, so basically this. So because of like HR, like compliance, HR law, they have to send you something like that. Like they
Okay.
have to. So even though you do the referral and you networked internally within a company, which by the way is like a great idea. You should always try and do that first
Sure,
before you
sure.
just go into a company blind, right? You should always try and network in first.
Mhm.
But even if you do that and you get a referral and they're like, and your friend's like, hey, my friend Scott's awesome, you should check him out. The hiring manager looks at it and like, okay, he's good, but this other person also worked in like, aerospace, and we need somebody who's also worked
Yeah.
in aerospace. So we're going to hire this person. And then they've got to reject you out of the system. They have to send you that email.
Okay. Okay, well, I mean, it's interesting to hear that. I'm glad to hear that because I mean, when you get those rejections that are no context, they're not contextualized, and it's like
Yeah,
I understand that, especially today where you have jobs where there can be upwards of 700 to 1,000 applicants, that becomes the norm. But sometimes we wonder, okay, if we had that slight extra nudge there from someone who might have known the recruiter or whatever, why do we get rejected outright? But that makes sense. So I think the whole goal of this particular episode is one we should probably get into is,
right.
when you finally get that golden ticket right there, and you get the call from the recruiter or the sourcer, and you're about to eh, join your first phone screen. What do you do, and how do you prepare for
Right.
that?
First of all, don't panic.
Right.
No, so I mean, a couple things. Definitely prepare, right? And I know it's hard to put in the same effort and the same preparation you would for like that first company you talk to versus the 50th one you talk to.
Sure.
But if you want the job, then you got to put in the work. So it does behoove you. I use that word again, to
Move.
learn about the company, learn about the group, learn
Mhm.
about the hiring managers in that group, right? You can easily go onto LinkedIn and run a search for that job, who the manager is, learn about them and their team, anything you can find.
A side note to that before you go on, I also noticed that a lot of recruiters and sourcers will include that information, so they'll basically act as coach for you through the whole process, and they'll provide you as you go into these new calls. Okay, here's that person's LinkedIn profile. Here's a blog that
Yeah,
they've done, just so you have that background. So it's been my experience that, at least working with sourcers and recruiters who know what they're doing, that they're going to be there to really help you. They're, so you use them as a resource, and the information that they send you, make sure you're double clicking into that.
yeah. So once you actually talk to them, yes, if they're good, they should help you because it's in their best interest to help you get
Right.
the job.
Right.
So definitely research those things, research the company, key players. I mean, if it's a totally new industry, then you probably want to educate yourself on that industry.
Right.
Anything like that. And also, you should also be prepared to talk about what it is that you're looking for in a role, and be prepared to talk about what it is that makes you a good fit for this particular role.
Now, this is something that creates kind of existential dread in me. Okay, it's like when a company comes to you and says, even in the application process, I've noticed a lot of companies are saying, "Why do you want to work with us?" Now, okay, there's a correct answer for that,
You
and
were
then there
number
is
48 on my list.
right. Then there's the recruiter. I mean, not the recruiter answer, but the candidate answer. Now, I don't know how candid I want to be here with this because I am a candidate, but generally when you're in a situation where you've been looking a lot longer than I have, and you may be verging on desperation because you either don't have any money coming in, or you need to do whatever you can do to get food on the table, your perspective changes. And
Right.
so when you're asking someone who's been searching for a year, and why do you want to work with us, the first thing that pops to mind is, really, seriously, why do I want to work with you? Let's see, paycheck, that's why I want to work with you. Now,
Right.
so from the sourcing perspective, do you ever get people who are that candid? And if so, do they ever move on in the process?
I have, yes, I have had that, but typically the reason why that's asked is because in theory, you as the candidate have multiple companies that will want you to work for them,
Yeah.
and so they want to know, why would you choose us?
Right.
It makes sense. It's a little bit, lip service.
Yeah.
It's all of that, but it's kind of due to that theory, and they want to know, like, why would this person stay here? Because it costs a lot of money for them to hire somebody who's going to
Right.
come work for them, and then 4 months later the job they really wanted is available and they just jump ship, right? Because now
Sure.
the recruiter, the company, that org has lost all of that time and money, and now they
Yeah.
have to start the search over again. And that costs
Yeah.
them a lot of resources. So they want to make sure that if you want to do this, that you really want to do it.
Oh no, that makes absolute sense, especially on the surface. I mean, I guess as a candidate, I'm very thoughtful about who I apply to. So even though, I've been looking for a few months at this point, I'm still reading through each one of those JDs. And then I'm going into the website saying, is this something that I can kind of parlay my experience into and my skill set? But is it also something that is compelling enough for me as a candidate to come in and make a difference? So while, I'm not as crass as to say I'm looking for a paycheck, we're all looking for paychecks. That's great. But I do spend a fair amount of time when I'm preparing for these calls with screeners in understanding the business, its model, the messages that it's putting forward. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something where I get what you're saying, and I basically embody that as a candidate. But I imagine there is that frustration a lot of times when candidates come
Yes.
in and they're asked that question repeatedly. Why do you want to work here? Okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and also another thing too is that the ratio of like talking between the recruiter or sourcer
Mm-hmm.
and the candidate.
No.
The ratio is if the recruiter is doing like all the talking, then
Mm-hmm.
you don't have a very good recruiter, right?
Okay.
The recruiter should be asking like a couple questions, clarifying, maybe talking a
Right.
little bit about the company, but they want to get all of that information out of the candidate. They want the candidate to be talking like 80% of the time. Now, if you do an
That's
interview,
interesting.
so if you do an interview and the recruiter is doing all the talking, then you don't have a very good recruiter.
Okay, and I guess does that extrapolate into if the recruiter is doing all the talking, then you don't have a really good chance of getting into that company?
Well, it's just me. I mean, it just means that they're kind of like saying all the stuff they want to say, but like they're not asking the right questions to figure out your experience, right?
Yes. And it's funny actually hearing that because a couple of the calls that I've had as pre-screens, that's what happened. I'd get on the phone and the recruiter would say, they'd go off on this huge tangent and talk about, oh, this is what I do. This is how long I've been at the company. This is why I would work at this company. This is what you're going to expect. This is who the boss is. This is the role. This is blank, 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 blank. 2 minutes before the end of the call is supposed to happen. So tell me a little bit about yourself. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean,
I
this is what
mean,
you do your 15-second elevator pitch or what?
yes, that's basically when you would do it. I mean, I don't know if that's good, but that's when you would do it. I mean, what they should be doing is they should allow the space for you to ask those questions, because like a
Yeah,
good candidate will say like, hey, why do you work here?
right.
Or a good candidate will say, well, why do you stay here after 4 years? You've been here for 4 years. Why are you still here?
Yeah,
Like those type, a good candidate will ask those questions, but a good recruiter or sourcer will ask the candidate, hey, tell me about a time that you did this thing
yeah, yeah.
and what happened from it. And so the candidate would like talk about a situation that relates to like this job that they're looking at,
Hmm.
talk about what happened, talk about their responsibilities, and then talk about the results. Like that's the stuff that should be happening so that the interviewer, the recruiter can make sure that they're getting the right person. Because
Okay.
otherwise, if they don't ask you those questions, they're really just like looking at you as a warm body and looking at your resume or LinkedIn profile and being like, okay, yeah, we'll send them on to the hiring manager. But that's like,
Yeah, then that diminishes your chances of actually getting something that would be looked at as compelling as far as an offer goes. Um, I have a side question here, and it's something that just kind of came into mind is that before I'm talking with the recruiter or screener, I'm also going to Glassdoor and I'm looking at Glassdoor
ooh,
reviews. So I've had situations where I'll look at a company
blind.
that has 1,000 reviews and basically the CEO approval is 62% and the company recommendation is 57%. And I'm reading some of the reviews and I'm becoming discouraged because of some of the comments that are in there. I have to think about, okay, so when I get on the call with that screener, knowing what I know from the field, how do I address something like that? I mean, is that something that we ask about in in a call like that, if the screeners even got any information as far as internal dynamic. So what
Yeah.
happens with a situation like that?
I mean, so I would take like, so there's like Blind, there's like Glassdoor, I mean, there's Yelp,
Yeah,
right? I mean, so I mean, with any of those review sites, you take them with a grain of salt because they can easily get skewed. Like you can get somebody who review bombs a company, right?
right.
So it's like when you go onto Amazon to buy like a product, right? You look at like all of like the great reviews, and then you flip it and look at all of the super bad ones, and you look at, okay,
Right.
well, why are they writing this, right? Behind every bad review, there's a story that could be true, but could also be like a disgruntled employee who was just let go for poor performance, and they would
Right.
feel that
Exactly.
they were let go because of another reason, right?
That's fair. Yeah.
So I think you take it with a grain of salt. You can still read it, but it's also good to look at the people who've been at the company, look at how many years they've been at the company,
Yeah.
and also listen to the hiring manager when you talk to them. Listen to them talk about like what the culture is, what the belief system, core values are of the company, and
Sure.
what they do to follow it. That can like also help you, make that decision. I mean, there's always going to be a negative review for every single company.
Well, right. And actually, on the flip side of that token, you've got companies who are, large enterprises who have been voted best places to work for whatever year you're
Right.
in. But I've had experience at some of those larger providers, and I can tell you from that experience that it's not always rosy. In fact, I've had some of the most toxic workplace environments at companies who have received 90% CEO ratings and 90% return recommendations. And that's because while you might have the review bombs from disgruntled ex-employees, you've also got review bombs from
Mm,
internally where people are
exactly.
basically coaxed to leave those
Upping,
reviews.
yeah, they're upping the score, which is something that all companies do that. All
Oh yeah, yeah.
companies have their employees that go on and like, post something, try and like balance out like, the scores because they know it's important.
Right. So I guess the takeaway for me from that is, yeah, like you said, take it with a grain of salt because there are going to be reviews in there that are going to come out as more viable than
Yeah.
others. I mean, you can usually tell when someone leaves a forum review when they're basically, asked to do that, when it's really positive or when it's really negative. You can sometimes get a sense for, okay, well, that person was probably just really pissed off about something in the role that they had. So I appreciate that insight. Now, before we got on this call, we chatted briefly about kind of some of the things that would fall within preparing for the initial screening and things that you
Yeah.
want to do and things that you don't want to do. And you'd mentioned something about lying during a call, and I'm like, lying? Who lies during an interview call? So what did you mean by that?
I
I'm
mean,
curious.
interviews are funny. The interviews are just funny, like concepts, because you basically have like kind of like two fake situations being acted out on video or phone or
Yes.
in person, but you have two situations being acted out.
Right.
And I say acted out because basically on one side, you have the recruiter or the sourcer or hiring manager trying to put themselves and their company and their role and their org in the best light. And on the other side, you have the candidate putting themselves and their experiences and their past in the best light. And
Right. Right.
you're trying to pretend that it's all real. So again, that's like a super nihilist kind of like way of looking at it, but
Sure.
there's some evidence of truth in there. So when it comes to lying, I mean, you can lie, um, but even if you somehow like are able to lie your way through like part of the interview, eventually you will get to a point where you will stumble, right?
Right.
You'll get to like the interview panel with the hiring manager and other
Hmm.
members of the team who also do the same job that you will be doing,
Yep.
and they'll ask you questions and you won't be able to answer them.
Right. Right.
So even if you do somehow get past the recruiter, like eventually it's gonna bomb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now there are extreme cases. Now this is true. I'm sure you've heard about this before, where you have like candidates who are like software engineers who like have somebody else take like a software coding quiz, and they get all the way through the interview, and then when they get on site, the people who they're working with and they actually have the job realize that they can't actually code, and it's because it's because they never were the original coder. It was somebody else doing it for them.
Right. Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say that as a hiring manager at one point, I actually fell for that once. And I was actually establishing a Q&A lab for a PR agency, a large global one. And I was bringing in someone to basically work with the computers to make golden units for review. And I I realize in retrospect that when I interviewed this person, um, I was feeding kind of answers in context through my conversation because I really was bought into the personality. And I think, something I've heard over the past many years is the personality and the way you come off to the interviewer is a lot of why you get pushed on to the next stage. It's less about what you actually bring to the table early on like that. So I think that really jives with what you're saying is, eventually you're going to hit a wall and you're going to
Yeah.
meet that person that calls you out for what you are.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't have that. And that guy got hired and a whole lot of bad stuff happened afterward. And I won't go into it further. But
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say in general, I mean, like everyone kind of like embellishes, I believe is the word, a little
yeah,
bit on their profile. But again, that will only take you so far. Even if you somehow manage to get hired, um, if you're not that good, if you cannot walk the walk, like you won't last very long at the company, and then you'll
right.
just be, on the street again, and the recruiter might get like, dinged for like, believing you along with like maybe the hiring team, but you'll be of course back on the street looking for another job, right? Within a
Right.
few months. So I think it's good when you're, instead of trying to like totally like fluff up situations, to
Right.
really just talk about things using the, when a recruiter asks you a question or a situation, or even a hiring manager asks you something,
Mhm.
when they ask you something, frame it in the STAR interview format. And
What is that? I mean, so this is something that was kind of new to me, even though I've employed it without
yeah,
realizing what the acronym was.
yeah. So it's like a pretty universal thing. STAR interview format. It's like situation, task, action, and then result. So that will stick in the minds of like a recruiter or sourcer or even a hiring manager, of how you did something, right? What was the situation? What was the
Mhm.
problem? And then what were you tasked with in order to kind of like solve that thing or that problem or that piece of software or that project?
Mhm.
And then what were the actions that you took? Was there trial and error? Like what were those actions? And then what was the result? And how did you measure that result? Like companies are really huge on like performance measurements, metrics. So how did you measure the results of whatever that thing is? So
Sure,
for my
sure.
industry, it's easy to measure things like, number of candidates found, number of like, candidates hired, stuff like that. For like people who are in the industry, how many products did you ship? How many units did you ship?
Mhm.
How many lines of code did you write? Like how many marketing campaigns did you launch? How many products were you part of? It's like all
Sure.
that stuff can be measured. So you want to make sure that when you answer your questions, you kind of answer them in that kind of like format.
And that's good advice. I mean, I've been stumped a couple of times where, I've got all of these things that I've done and I've brought to the table and successes I've had, but I hadn't thought ahead of time to really put that into a cohesive format. And that's something that I've rectified over the past couple of job cycles, but it was really a hindrance to me because when you come out and someone throws a question like that, you should be prepared to answer that. I mean, what do you bring to the
Yeah.
table? Because I mean, we know you understand the job role, but
Yeah.
what successes have you seen and what challenges have you addressed successfully? So that's
Yeah.
really good advice there, I think.
Yeah. And the things that you'll get asked almost every time, which you can pretty much guarantee, which means you can probably prepare like some good stuff for this. You're going to get asked about like, some huge insurmountable problem that you were tasked with solving. What did
Right.
you do to solve it? Um, Give me an example of a time where you were tasked with something and you actually just failed. Like they
Right.
actually want to know about that.
Oh yeah.
Then they also want to know about times when you had conflict with like either another person on the team, how that get resolved, or conflict with somebody else on another team that you had to work with. How did you guys
Hmm.
get that resolved? Right.
Yeah.
Those types of questions, they want to know those answers to. And then of course, if you are in like management, how you worked with like, your manager, or if you're an IC, how well did
Hmm.
you work with your partners, or, the people on the team. So
Right.
those are the questions that you'll get asked every time almost.
So that's interesting. And a quick side note, I think it's worth drilling down a little bit into when a recruiter asks you time that you failed, and a failure is not necessarily a bad thing, because
Right.
a failure is from a candidate perspective should be used as a situation that you're able to demonstrate how you addressed that failure and how you were able to be dynamic and find a solution and move through it. I mean, that's what I would do. It's not something that I necessarily view as bad, but you want to be thoughtful in terms of what kind of failure you talk about. I mean, because there are failures, and then there are failures that you don't want to necessarily share.
Yeah. Yeah. There's ones, I mean, I think when you do that, you want to talk about a situation where like, yeah, it didn't work out. It was a total failure. But then the next time you did it, here were the solutions that we put in order to solve
Yeah.
it. What you don't want to do is say like, yeah, we did this, and then yeah, we just did it again.
Yeah, hey, and we kept doing it, thinking that it was going to change, but after all, insanity, we know the definition of that. So I know we're getting further along, close to the end here, but there are a couple of other points that we had discussed, and I think of interest to me as a candidate would be your perception on interview etiquette on the candidate's side, and kind of the
Yes.
perception of the recruiter. So is that something you can talk to?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean, of course, I mean, there's like the basic stuff with everyone knows, like make sure that you make sure you have like you're gonna show up to the interview on time, show up early.
Yeah.
Um, you're probably going to be using some sort of like video sharing software. So make sure you have like the plugin or the download or whatever it is. Some of them are
Right.
easier than others. But whatever it is, Zoom, Teams, WebEx,
WebEx.
Google Meet, whatever it is, make sure that it's working, right? Because nothing is worse than just like showing up like a minute before and then realizing like, oh my God, I need this plugin. Wait, my browser settings
Right.
won't accept this. Wait a second, I can't actually access this on my browser. And you're like, going
Panic.
crazy. Yeah, panicking. So that's just bad. So make sure you have all of that worked out beforehand.
Check.
Um, Also make sure you have a list of your questions that you want to ask the recruiter, right?
Right.
If it's a sourcer, they may or may not be able to give you like an exact dollar figure for the comp, but they can give you a range, right? So that could
Right.
be a question that you have prepared. You can also have things prepared like, how long has this job search been open? Why are
Hmm.
you looking for this role right now? Why is it open? Like what is the business
Yep.
need that we're trying to fill with this role open? Right.
Right.
Those show some sort of intelligence behind the role, and shows that you're interested in it from like a higher level perspective.
And that's a very important and salient point, in that I think a lot of candidates come in with one bag of questions that they apply to every person they talk with. And really, if you've been interviewing for only a short period of time, or you're new in your career, one thing you want to make sure you do is understand who you're speaking with, and speak to that person. Because if you're asking a recruiter about the technical challenges in any a coding project that the team is working on, chances are you're not going to be met with a whole lot of enthusiasm, and you won't be getting anything really useful to pull out of that. So again, just understand who you're talking with. Those are the high level questions, as Mark pointed out, to a recruiter or sourcer who may or may not have a really in depth understanding of what that role is, or what that hiring manager is looking to accomplish. And I'm not saying that they don't do their jobs, they do, but they have so many positions, I'm thinking, that they often are working on at any given time. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I mean, you want to make sure that you ask questions that help you stand out in the position that you're applying for.
Yeah. Now I will say though, if they are good, like a source or a recruiter will, they will have like a little bit more insight, and even to like a role that's technical. They'll say like, hey, you're going to get quizzed on like, operating system kernel calls.
Right.
So make sure you know what those are, right? So they'll give candidates hints if
Oh, yeah.
so they will give them some hints on that type of stuff. And it's not like they're cheating or something like that. Because there's no way you could cheat with something like that. It's like saying like,
Right.
hey, make sure you brush up on your computer science algorithm basics. You're like, okay, you didn't really give me any hints. Just like I'm gonna get hit with the hammer here
Right.
when I'm in the interview. So they're not cheating. They're not prepping you. They're just helping you understand what's going to come to you when you're in that interview.
Right. And points well
Yeah.
taken.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to imply anything other than
yeah. No, I mean and again, the good recruiters will do that, but there are plenty of bad recruiters.
Yes, there are. I've come across a few of those, and I won't mention any names, but yeah, they were very uncomfortable and long drawn out processes. So
we'll post a list in the comments of all the bad ones.
Right. you get the lawyers as well that we can call for slander. So probably not. So the final point I think that we wanted to discuss was kind of the after the interview and the follow-up, the thank you, next steps. Everything's changed. Everything's changed in the past few years, and the way we do business, the way we interview for business, and the way we get jobs and do jobs. How has that affected the follow-up and what is expected at this point of candidates in this process?
Yeah, so that's like a huge one. So obviously you want to you definitely want to follow up. So I want to say that you definitely want to follow up. You definitely want to follow up with the recruiter or sourcer. If you do speak with the hiring manager, you want to follow up with a thank you note to the hiring manager.
Mm-hmm.
You say, you follow up, say, thanks for doing the interview. It was great finding out all that information. I'm interested in finding out next steps. Or if you're not, let's say you talk to the recruiter and you're like, you know what, these guys are whack. I'm not going to work for this company. So then you reply back and say like, hey, thanks for the interview. I think I'm going to look at some other roles because I don't think this one is quite right for me. And they're like, okay, fine. But just whatever it is, just do something.
Okay.
And if you don't get a response, again, set yourself a reminder to follow up with that person again in like a week or a week and a half.
Right.
But stay on them, because while it seems like you just went into like the black hole of like, the application there, it could be because like either the hiring manager is like making a decision still, or they're not even there. The hiring manager could have been like, hey, recruiter, go interview these 10 people. I'll come back in 2 weeks from my vacation.
Yeah.
Right. And you have no idea, as a candidate, you have no idea that's happening, but that could very well be happening on the back end.
And that's some of the most maddening, moments for the candidate. I've had that a number of times where you're apparently or supposedly, according to the hiring manager and the recruiter, the top candidate, but all of a sudden everything goes black. And you have no idea why you're just sitting there for a month waiting for someone to follow up, and really the onus is on you as well. So as Mark pointed out, basically you want to make sure that you're repeatedly reinforcing your commitment and your interest in a role. I mean, don't do it so often that you aggravate someone, but at least every couple of weeks, right? Or every week, depending on how hot that role is and how active they are in hiring for it. And it's something that I've found as well that it helps a lot, and it's actually, I feel, gotten me to the next steps of a process when something feels like it's stalled out. And you can't do everything, but to the extent that you can control your position and your the perception of you as a candidate in that process, you want to make sure that you're being visible. You're being proactive and reactive quickly when someone responds to you.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah, and I will say this too. Sometimes like somebody actually leaves in a company who is part of that process, and it completely derails everything, and everything gets there's nobody picking up the slack. So that's, again, that happens on the candidate side. You'll have no idea that's happening.
Right.
You'll just be like, time is passing by and you don't know what's going on.
And that's the thing. We've each got different agendas. So I mean, the candidate is often stressed out about, okay, I have to move on this fast, but don't these recruiters understand, how important this is? Well, yes, but there are also a lot of moving parts. And I'd actually not thought about, what if that person just left? And it's happened a couple of
It's
times.
totally happened. Yeah. So it's also good idea too. Like, I mean, you let the recruiter know, hey, I'm talking to multiple companies. I expect to hear back from these other companies. So it helps kind of light a fire under their butt so that
Right.
they don't think that they have all the time in the world to get back to you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think all are good suggestions. And in closing, Mark, do you have any last comments that you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a numbers game when it comes to like kind of like looking for a job. I mean, obviously you're not gonna, most of the time you don't apply to like one and then get hired.
Right.
So I think you want to make sure that you hedge your bets though and apply to ones that you're actually like going to be a fit for, right?
Absolutely.
Don't apply for ones where it's a real stretch of the imagination to kind of like, see you in that role. You want to, because there are plenty of other people who like match that role exactly, and you're
Right.
just kind of like clogging up the pipeline there. So obviously apply to ones that you are a fit for.
Hmm.
Um, Prepare, like I said, prepare all the stuff you can. Prepare your questions. Prepare to ask questions why you want to work there, why they want to work there, what they're looking for, because you want to make sure that you're a right fit and you want to make sure this is the right decision for you.
Sure.
And then just making sure that you answer questions about based around solving problems, how you solved a problem and what the results were, right? Because that's
Right.
the kind of stuff that will stick with the company, especially companies that measure based on performance or like key outcomes or key performance indicators.
Absolutely.
And then make sure that you follow up. Just follow up, make sure you follow up with the source of recruiter, and do it do with frequency, whatever that frequency is.
Excellent advice. And with that, we are soliciting questions from the field. So, as I mentioned in the previous episodes, you can be sent DMs to either myself or Mark, and that's LinkedIn, or you can reach me by email at scott@arphilic.com. That's scott@arphilic.com. Mark, you want to take us out?
Yes, thank you very much. You have just witnessed another podcast of The Recruiter of Oz. See you guys next time.
Bye bye.